Zum Künstlergespräch mit Sacco. Das Gespräch wird in englischer Sprache geführt. Das war natürlich schon vor, es wird keine Übersetzung geben. Wir werden das Gespräch in Englisch führen. Ich mache nur die kleine Einführung zu Sacco jetzt noch auf Deutsch, bevor ich selber ins Englische zu switchen versuche. Ich denke, ich muss nicht sehr viel sagen über Sacco. Ich sage deswegen nur das Wesentlichste, nur den kleinen Rahmen ihn besser situieren. Also Sacco ist 1960 auf Malta geboren, er ist bis heute Malteser und nicht Amerikaner, wie man sehr oft liest. Er lebte ein paar Jahre in Australien, wuchs aber und verbrachte bis heute die meiste Zeit in den USA. Er studierte Journalismus, zeichnete aber auch leidenschaftlich Comics. Er hat schon sehr früh seine eigene Heftreihe gehabt bei Fantagraphic Comics, ich glaube in den späten 80er Jahren, die Heftreihe Yahoo, wo er sehr autobiografisch arbeitete. Und 1991 erlebte er so einen Schlüsselmoment, das war der erste Irakkrieg, den er vor dem Fernsehen verbrachte als CNN-Junkie. Und diese Erfahrung des live erlebten Kriegs macht ihn auch, sensibilisierte ihn für die Lage im Nahen Osten, und er ging dann nach Palästina, um dort zu recherchieren, um dort auch mit Palästinensern zu sprechen, und das führte dann zu seiner ersten großen Reportage Palästina. Damit erlebte er ein Genre, das es eigentlich schon immer gegeben hat, die gezeichnete Reportage, auch die Comic-Reportage. Das ist also nicht in dem Sinne etwas Neues, was Sacco erfunden hätte, aber er hat diesem Genre ein neues Leben eingehaucht, nachdem es jahrelang so gut wie nicht existierte. Und er hat natürlich auch mit seinem journalistischen und künstlerischen Anspruch da eine sehr hohe Messlatte gesetzt. Er ist bis heute der wahrscheinlich zweifellos berühmteste Comic-Journalist, Comic-Reporter, und ist so ein bisschen der Inbegriff dessen, was wir in den letzten Jahren erlebt haben in diesem Bereich des Non-Fiction-Comics, des dokumentarischen Comics, des journalistischen Comics. Das ein paar Fakten zu Sacco, mehr wird er dann selber erzählen. And of course, you were invited here to Erlangen not because of a strictly journalistic work, but because of a historical work. You did this big leporello on the First World War, on the Battle at the Somme. So for this work, you kind of left your position as a journalist to become a historian.
Well, thank you for coming, and thank you, Christian, who I've known for a long time. Können Sie English? Yeah, good. I guess since I've done a lot of journalism work, it's hard to avoid history in my journalism work. And when you're writing books about the Palestinians, you go back into history, 1948, other times. And I did a book in English called Footnotes in Gaza, which is about Gaza, at least partly about Gaza in 1956. So I was reconstructing a historical episode then. So I've had some dealings with history, but this was strictly a historical event, and obviously one that I didn't have a direct connection to. So it was different, and one of the reasons I did it is because it was different, because I just, from a creative sense, I needed to change. And there are other reasons, but that was one of the ones that made me sort of decide that it would be a good thing to do.
I will be curious about the other reasons as well, but let me ask you first, I mean, you mentioned this Gaza book where you go back to an incident, to a massacre which took place in 1956, in the 1950s, but you researched it to get a better understanding of what's going on today, so it was in part of a bigger concept where you dealt with today. So when going back to the Battle of the Somme, did you do it from our time's perspective, or did you try to recreate how it was then, or did you try to find some kind of lessons we might learn from the First World War? Is there any direct connection with what is going on at the moment?
Well, you know, it's a very subjective work. on the one hand, I'd say it's a very distant sort of look at the First World War, but any artist approaches a work like that through, I won't say from our point of view, but through my point of view. My point of view probably agrees with those historians who feel that the First World War wasn't a war worth fighting from almost any perspective, and that the way it was fought was extremely brutal and nonsensical. I think when people came out of the First World War on all sides, they must have had a big question mark hovering over them, like why? It might have been easier in the Second World War when, after the camps were liberated, you sort of understood what it was about, and you can sort of answer the why. But in the First World War, I think it's hard to sort of say what it was all about. So I'm basically horrified by what happened in the First World War. I have been since I was a kid. I'm not sure if that answers your question, completely.
No, but it answers an important part of it. Well, you mentioned that you needed a new challenge as an artist, as a really new creative channel. So is it on the part of you as the artist in you or the journalist, historian in you?
Well, I've been thinking, I realize now that journalism doesn't answer all the questions I've had. And the more I've spent time in the field, the more I've begun to wonder about human psychology. I mean, journalism can talk about politics, it can talk about history, and all those sorts of things, but at some point, I think it was when I was working on the book about footnotes, I was working on the book about Gaza, and I was trying to draw soldiers who were shooting civilians in cold blood. And after I drew the book, someone said, "Why don't you draw the faces of the soldiers?" And I realized, I didn't really know it was subconscious, that I didn't draw the faces of ordinary men killing ordinary people because I didn't know what people think when they're doing that. And it made me realize that I was interested now in human nature. You can't explain everything with politics. Why does an ordinary person do what they do under those situations? So it began to make me think about hierarchy, how people behave in groups. And that's why this book about the First World War sort of appealed to me, because it gave me a chance to think of humanity as a mass, as opposed to humanity, take it individually, as most of my work is done.
What is well, many people here have seen the big blown-up version of your Leporello, which is really very impressive, and one can also kind of enjoy your style, your drawing skills on another dimension, so to speak. And I was struck again about how detailed you like to work and how kind of yes, realistic.
It's funny because I'm not sure I can say I like to work in a detailed fashion, but it's just what comes out of my hand. I studied journalism, and journalism is about details, I think. And especially the way I draw my journalism, I'm interested in really recreating what a place looks like. So if I'm drawing a town in Bosnia, it's not any town in Bosnia, it's a particular town in Bosnia. So I'm trying to draw specific buildings and things like that. And so when I was doing this World War I piece, I mean, believe me, there's part of me that just wants to say, okay, let me just draw this really quick. But I just don't think like that, and my hand won't let it happen. So I start drawing the details. And then if you're going to draw the details, you have to get the details right. So that takes some time.
Why are you so interested in this, why this obsession with detail? Because that's actually the drawing would allow you to make a kind of a more free interpretation of reality, and maybe to leave certain things out or leave certain things to the mind of the person who looks at it.
You probably have to ask my therapist.
Is he here?
No, I don't actually have a therapist. But it comes from journalism, and the main thing for me is to make people feel, at least to some extent, that they can be in that picture. So even with most of my journalism, I want people to sort of open the page, and if they see a refugee camp, they can sort of feel it. It's not abstract. I think you can do journalism in more of an abstract sort of style, but I've just always been, had some appeal, I've always been interested in detail. And you know, I realized, having conversations like this, with this kind of question, I realized a lot of the way I look at things is from my childhood perspective. You know how you open up those great children's books that have, you know, how did people live in the Middle Ages? And it's a castle, and you can see inside the dungeon, and you see the knights, and then you see the women are learning French or sewing or something. I mean, just all these little details going on at once. And I was really drawn to that sort of stuff. I was really drawn to those sort of large illustrations with, gave you a real feeling for life. And you know, as an adult, you don't get that anymore. But I think we're still, there's some appeal for it, at least on my part. I imagine the readers have, there's some appeal from them also.
Let us go back to the beginnings. I mentioned your first comic book, Yahoo, where you did mostly autobiographical comics. How did you conceive comics back then when you started Yahoo? What did they mean to you, and why did you choose to tell about your own life?
Well, they weren't all autobiographical, but some part of them were. I thought of Yahoo as sort of an experimental comic. Other cartoonists had characters, like fictional characters that they, like, I don't know if you're familiar with Hate by Peter Bagg. There's Buddy Bradley, and you know, you read the adventures of Buddy Bradley, which are very funny. But I was never really that interested in having a character that you followed. That reminded me too much of TV serials. So I wanted to do some nonfiction. So one of these comics, Yahoo, was about my mother's experiences in World War II. I wanted to do some autobiography, and I did a story about being with a rock band as a roadie. I wasn't a singer or anything. Being a roadie with a rock band, traveling in Europe. Another was about living in Berlin and having a long-distance relationship with a girlfriend in the United States and breaking up. I mean, this kind of a story. And then there were all these little stories about people in strange situations, sort of satirical, socially satirical stories. So I conceived it as a very much a, you know, I'll do whatever I want in this, and it didn't sell, let's say that.
Well, we'll come to your successes a bit later, but let us stay with this Yahoo series. I mean, it was an interesting mixture because suddenly you could see how the autobiography mutated more and more this sort of well, journalism, reportage, or reflection of your surroundings, or things like those. Was this a conscious moving to this to these kind of stories, like when you did the story about your mother or the interview with the exotic dancer?
No, it wasn't. I mean, the thing is, I'd studied journalism, and I realized it's just the way I perceive the world without being completely conscious of that. So even when I was with this rock band, we were in the van, and you know, you're taking these long drives from, you know, someplace in Portugal to someplace in France overnight. And you know, all I did was I had a sketch pad. I purposefully didn't take a camera with me because I wanted to learn how to sketch properly. And then these guys were funny. I mean, they weren't a boring group of people. So they were always joking and sort of fighting, and I was always just writing down exactly what they were saying. And you know, I had studied journalism, so to get their words right was important to me. But I wasn't thinking of it really strictly as a journalistic piece. And the same is true with my mother's story. She was growing up in Malta during the war, and Malta was very heavily bombed by the Germans and the Italians. So I would ask her questions like, tell me about life living in the shelter. And she would write a letter about it. And some of these stories I'd heard when I was growing up, and others were sort of new to me. And then I just sort of used her words and made a story out of this. So I did. In some ways, I was learning techniques during Yahoo that I would later use in journalism without thinking that I was leading up to anything. You know, it's all sort of, no theory behind it, just sort of an organic process.
But somehow it, well, if you look at it retrospectively, of course, autobiography can be considered as kind of a reportage or a journalist approach to your own life.
If you're being truthful, and I guess a lot of autobiography is image making, and a lot of it is falsely self-deprecating, and I might be guilty of that to some extent. But yes, I mean, if you're trying to recreate something that's that's maybe on the way to something a bit more journalistic, but not necessarily.
You mentioned that Yahoo didn't sell. Then you started this huge commercial project called Palestine.
Oh, huh? Yes.
And now you're here in this big room. It's totally sold out. You're one of the, you're a star. You're a famous star. So, right when you began with Palestine, it wasn't like this.
No, not at all. I mean, in those days, the graphic novel, what is called the graphic novel, really hadn't found its feet. So most cartoonists in the States, I don't know the situation in Europe. We were doing comic books. I mean, literally those 32-page, 24-page comic books like children would get, except these were for adults. So what became Palestine was actually 9 comic books that came out. You know, I'd draw one and then they'd publish it. I'd draw another one, they'd publish it, and there were 9. And it just sold progressively less as time went by. So by the 9th issue, I think it sold under 2,000, which by all rights my publishers should have canceled it. But I guess they thought, oh well, we're almost at the end, we'll bite the bullet.
Were you disappointed? Or how did you, I mean, did you expect it that it would not be a bestseller, or did you expect it?
I didn't, I thought it was commercial suicide, basically. Because the last book I'd done was, you know, about rock bands and all that, and that's a bit more commercial, but yeah, I didn't really expect it to sell. But there are things you can do when you're in your 20s and early 30s that are hard to do when you're in your 40s or 50s. So I could live closer to the ground, let's say. I mean, you can sort of be a hunter-gatherer when you're in your 20s or 30s. But it was disappointing, but I didn't mind. I mean, I was sort of in it for its own sake. It was kind of art for the art's sake. And you know, you get older and you realize you've got to make a living, or it's never going to happen.
Why was it so important to you, this Palestine story, that you went through with it?
Because I was, you know, because if you grow up in the United States, you get a very different impression of what's going on in the Middle East than you do if you're living in Europe. I mean, I spent time in Europe, and I realized, well, people have a very different viewpoint. But I was sort of pissed off, basically, because having studied journalism, at some point, I realized that through journalism, through American-style journalism, I basically thought Palestinians were terrorists. That was kind of my impression of them. And I realized later, when I began to educate myself, that this was sort of the fault of the objective style reporting. Because you can report objective facts. Let's say there's a bus bombing or a hijacking of a plane by Palestinians. You can report those facts and they can all be true, but there are other parts of that story that you never hear about. And also you don't hear about the context. And I realized basically through osmosis, without really paying attention to the issue, but just through osmosis, I was getting a very one-sided viewpoint. And that began to change for me personally at the time of the Sabra Shatila massacre in 1982 in Beirut. It made me question the whole narrative. I thought, wow, I thought Palestinians were terrorists, but why are they being slaughtered like this? It made me just begin to think, and it took years to educate myself. And I was basically furious at American-style journalism, having studied journalism myself in that American way. And I thought, you know, it's more like, well, I just want to go see for myself and let Palestinians speak for themselves, you know, whatever they say. I want to hear their voices.
So you made this huge project about Palestine. It didn't sell while it came out of the book, so you had, with the book you had certain feedback, at least critically, but you still went on doing journalism. You went to Gorazde, you went to ex-Yugoslavia to write and draw about the war in Bosnia. But I remember meeting you in the 90s that you always said that, oh, it's the last thing I'll do, oh, and I quit. So were you really serious thinking about quitting journalism?
Sure. Do you all understand, am I speaking well enough, or okay, you understand? I was thinking about quitting journalism. It was in the middle of working on the book on Gorazde. I thought, okay, I'll finish this book, and then I'll stop. I felt I had to finish the book because I bothered so many people to get their stories, and it just seemed like the right thing to do. But, you know, I just didn't know how to pay the rent every month. And I was taking certain work that I just didn't want to do. and you know, to make money. And at some point, you know, you think, okay, you know, you can't go on a date, you don't have any money, you know, you can't buy anything really. If you run out of shaving cream, it's a disaster because you have to buy one, you know, stuff like that. And I thought I would become a math teacher, mathematics, because I'm pretty good at mathematics. And I thought that's as far away as I can get from art, and it's as far away as I can get from anything sort of, I won't say it's not creative, but to me there's like right and wrong, and you can correct papers very easily, then you can go home and drink a beer. And that's what I thought, maybe that's how I should live my life. Yeah, so it was actually a really hard moment for me. It was a series of some years actually.
So when did it change, or why did it change? What happened to make
Well, just before I was going to quit, I thought, okay, I'll get all my money together and I'll move to New York, because that's the place where it's going to happen. You know, if you can't make it, if you make it in New York, you know. But it wasn't about moving to New York. What happened is the book Garajda got reviewed in the New York Times, and that made all the difference. It's as if once the New York Times looked at it, everyone was going to look at it. And so it just got, that book suddenly did pretty well. And because that book did well, then Palestine was collected into one volume, and that did even better. So, you know, you can do what's considered good work, and no one's going to pay attention, and it's just not its time. Then you realize how many things are good work that never get their time, unfortunately. So it just worked for me. I mean, what you realize is, okay, I worked hard, and you know, not to take away anything from the work itself, because I think the work is generally good, but you know, luck plays some part in success.
How do you explain this sudden interest in these kind of comics, in this kind of non-fiction comics, from the part of media to write about, from the part of the public to read them, but also more and more then also from the side of newspapers and magazines interested in having shorter pieces by you?
Well, I think some of the path was set by Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which did very well, but just seemed like an anomaly, you know, something that's sort of apart from everything else. But I think it was just the non-fiction work. It just seemed at that time there were enough good cartoonists doing very serious work, even in fiction, that there was enough that it sort of had a critical mass. And it was just hard to ignore what was being done. Also what happened, I think, is some of the editors got younger. Because I would talk to older editors and they thought it was really strange what I was doing. Like, nah, this doesn't look any good. No, comics about the Palestinians. It didn't make any sense to them. But then you got, you know, a 30-year-old was in that job, and suddenly they were, let's say, hip, a bit more hip. They'd read Love and Rockets. And so they were willing to give the art form some consideration. That was another part of it. But I think mostly it was about a lot of people doing very good work at the same time. It just was the time.
Well, I think Garajda came out the same year than Jim Corrigan.
I think that's right, yeah. All these books were coming out at the same time, and they helped me and I helped them. I mean, it was one of those things where sometimes your peers, you're all helping each other somehow to form a field.
How do you approach the subjects you're going to research? Is it for the books? I think it's your own ideas, what you want to do, and when you do shorter pieces like the book Reportage, which came out at Edition Moderne, is it the magazine who comes to you with is it an assignment, or is it also you who propose this a subject and topic?
Right. Well, my life's changed a lot now. So if I want to do something, let's say I wanted to go to Iraq. And now I have an agent, which has made a big difference too. I have a very good agent, and it helps. But I would just write to her and say, I'd like to go to Iraq. Let me know if anyone's interested. And then I can ignore it, and that's her problem. And then a month later, she'll write back and say, these 3 magazines are interested in sending you. It's very different from how it used to be for me, really different. Because I had to finance my first 2 trips myself. And now I was getting money before I went just to go on these trips. So usually what I do is I come up with an idea, and then I'll tell my agent, you know, is The Guardian interested? And now magazines approach me too. sometimes they have very specific ideas about what they want me to do, and it has to be something I want to do. So if it's not, then I'm not going to do it. That's how it works now.
And how do you, for yourself, define the topics which are interesting to you? You mentioned Iraq. It doesn't surprise me that you would like to go to Iraq or will go to Iraq. What is it which appeals to you or which makes you want to go somewhere, even if it's a dangerous place to go there?
It's a feeling of compulsion, because there are many places you could go to, and some are very worthy of going to, but it's mainly what hits me in the gut. The Palestinian situation hit me in the gut. What happened in Bosnia hit me in the gut. At some point I wanted to get away from conflict reporting, and I've become more interested in things like poverty and human migration. So those things matter. I think they matter to a lot of people. They make a big impact on the world. So I sort of choose those stories that matter to me personally. And I've learned that if they matter to me, they're going to matter to other people. So I don't really second guess my choices.
You mentioned that, like for your first big reportage in Palestine, you had this this very strong idea, just to give another image of the Palestinians, or to tell their narrative, and not the usual narrative you could read in American magazines. How is it as a where do you draw the line between like being a journalist and like being an activist or expressing your own political or being an advocate for a cause?
I don't think of myself as an advocate or an activist. I think of myself as a journalist, but maybe one that's a bit different from the American model. I have my sympathies, and I think they're clear. My politics are, I think it's fair to say that Palestinians have been historically screwed. It doesn't mean that the Israelis haven't been screwed or the Jews haven't been screwed. That's not it. But because we don't hear the Palestinian side, it's a subjective decision to go and hear what they have to say. But then I try to be honest, because I make a difference between objectivity and honesty. So given that I want to hear Palestinian voices, I want to hear all voices, including ones that won't sound good to the Western audience, that will scare a Western audience, perhaps, because that's part of it. So I will report honestly on what I hear. I'm giving them a voice. I'm not cutting out voices from that selection of voices.
Yes, but like in the book of like Gaza, you have mentioned you speak with Palestinians. You almost don't speak with Israeli. Wouldn't be listening to all the voices, also to listen to Israeli voices?
It would be, and I did try. I mean, I spoke to General Dayan's chef de bureau, Mordecai Baron. He was very helpful, and I tried to find Israeli soldiers who'd been on that particular campaign. There was one Israeli soldier who wrote about what happened, and he wrote a very damning piece about what happened in 1956, and about seeing bodies and getting physically sick. Now, he had died, but I spoke to his widow, and she told me that a friend of his was still alive, who was in the same unit. So I managed to find this guy in Tel Aviv. But he really didn't help me out, I mean, to be honest. I have him in the book. He actually said, you know, my friend was inventing stories. So I basically put that line in there. So I have tried. I mean, I did talk to Israeli historians and people who were officers at the time. And if you talk to, I mean, Benny Morris is a very good Israeli historian. He's very right-wing now. But he's a good historian, and I spoke to him, and when I mentioned it, he said, "Oh, you mean the massacre?" I mean, right away, he didn't mince any words. He's totally pro-Israeli, but, you know, people talk more openly about what happens. No one sort of kids around over there. But you're right. I mean, the preponderance of voices is Palestinian in that book. Ultimately, they were the victims, and I think that's where the story lies.
To which extent do you consider yourself as somebody reporting facts, or somebody also making an interpretation of facts?
It's always an interpretation. I mean, I don't believe journalism can be objective. If I told you, no, I'm being really neutral, I'm just saying what I heard, and I'm trying to tell two sides, I think you always come to a filter. But I'll admit that I'm a filter. you sort of know where my sympathies lie or what my politics are by the subjects I choose. You know, I choose to talk to the poor instead of, you know, spend time on the tennis courts of Europe. So, I mean, that's a subjective choice. But then how I report matters to me. How I report, once I've decided where I'm going to go, has to do with honesty. Again, I'll say that.
To which extent the fact that you draw your stories and don't tell the stories just in words and photography, to which extent does it kind of help you to have this, to have your clear position, to not pretend that you're objective without being that?
It helps because it's hard to draw yourself out of the story. It's possible to do, I've tried it, but it's clumsy, I think. But when you draw yourself in the story, it's a signal to the reader that you're seeing things through my eyes. And you might disagree with me, but at least I'm being honest that there's a reporter on the ground. And as much as possible, I try to sort of demystify what reporting is, and how inaccurate it can be, how you can be misled. All those things are interesting, and most readers who read newspapers don't know that sort of thing. All journalists know that sort of thing.
Well, you like to talk about how you get the facts.
Yeah, the process is important, I think.
Just because that's so to make the reader know about how he gets other information.
Right. For example, in this book on Gaza, I spoke to a lot of older men, and now some have very clear recollections of what happened, and some don't. Some have general remembrances of what happened, but sometimes the stories don't fit together. I mean, sometimes there's a story there about a guy whose 3 brothers were killed. They were lined up and shot. He ran at the last moment and escaped. But in his telling of the story, he came back and watched his brother die that night, or later, maybe the next day. But then I spoke to his, the wife of one of the people shot and killed, and she said, no, he never came back. And spoke to another, a guy who was a boy and was in their family, and he said, no, he never came back. But instead of trying to find out exactly what happened, I just decided, okay, I'm never going to resolve this, so I'd rather confront the reader with this problem. Because that's what happens when you're dealing with memory. Memory is problematic. So why pretend it's not problematic? Why pretend that everyone remembers something the same way? Because they don't.
Do you think that kind of working with drawing this makes kind of impossible this kind of neutral, factual journalism?
There's always a tension between the traditional way of doing journalism, which is to get quotes accurately, and you know, my quotes are accurate, and then you're drawing what those quotes are representing. And a drawing is by definition a subjective act. You know, why am I drawing this as opposed to that? Why am I drawing it that way? Why am I drawing it from that angle? That's all subjective, so there's a tension there, and I can't pretend there isn't.
Is that which makes these kind of drawn repertoires so appealing nowadays to reader?
I think people are just, images really appeal to readers. I think that's one of the main things. We sort of forget the power of images. It's just easier in a way to approach a book that has images than one that's totally gray. I mean, usually when I came back from these trips, you know, I'm meeting a friend, and so tell me what happened in Bosnia. And after about 5 minutes, they're just going, they're falling asleep. And I don't tell stories well sometimes, and I think it's hard to tell very intense stories well. When you draw them, you can sort of give yourself a little distance, you can formulate the way to tell them. So, and I don't use the word lightly, you can sort of entertain the reader somewhat. You can pull the reader along, make it interesting for the reader. And that's something that sometimes is hard to do when you're actually speaking from your heart with someone about what happened. So it's possible for comics, I think, to do this.
Do you also think that as an artist, from what you said, I guess that as an artist, as a drawing artist, you have to identify, or you have to kind of accept or communicate to the reader that it's a subjective version. You cannot pretend like the writing journalist or the photographic journalist, I think, is a neutral reportage. You have to stand up and say, this is me.
Yeah, you can't pretend, because, I mean, think of this. If it's a very standard, let's say a print journalist is talking to someone, and someone tells him, well, they took us in a truck. For a print journalist, that's enough. That is general enough that it's true and it makes sense to everyone. Now, if I'm drawing that, my first question is, well, what kind of truck was it? So then I have to think about, okay, what am I going to do? I have to research the trucks from that time. Maybe I'm going to draw a truck that's from that time and from that country, but isn't the right truck. You try to get closer and closer to what you think might be true, but you can never exactly get there with it. But it's easy for print journalists to sort of avoid all those issues. They don't have to deal with it. And that's perhaps why some of them won't take it as seriously as I will.
So in a way, going your way by drawing the subjective, making this interpretation, you get closer to what was the actual truth and reality of the fact, even without having an objective picture of it.
As I try to get as close to it as I can get to it. If something happened in a certain place, I'll try to walk that same ground. In Gaza, a lot of the story in this book I did about Gaza, a lot of the story takes place in a schoolyard where thousands of people were kept by the soldiers, and that school still exists. So, you know, I walked around the school, the principal took me into the rooms to take the pictures of the rooms, you know, so as much as possible you're trying to be, even for yourself, even if no one else is going to know, you kind of have to be true for yourself as much as possible.
What is the function of your kind of journalism? Because you're very slow. I mean, to make Gaza took you 6 years. In the 6 years, there are probably many wars happening all over the world and many news every day. I mean, we live in a time where news go very quickly. They come, they fade, and then you come like this very slow person, 6 years with one reportage.
Well, not walking slow, but I'm working slow.
No, but what's I mean. It's a totally different type of journalism you're doing from that what we experience from day to day.
Yeah, and ironically, I fell in love with journalism in high school, and what I liked about it was, you know, you were given a story assignment and you had to finish it in 45 minutes. So you sat there with a sheet of paper and you realized, okay, you just have to get to the essential facts of what's happened. And I love that adrenaline rush of working really quickly, and now I'm doing the exact opposite. Yeah, it takes years to do these pieces. There are certain advantages of the way I work. I don't think it's exclusive to being a comics journalist, because I think if you're a magazine journalist, you might have this freedom too, but I will go to a place and spend, you know, 2 weeks, 2 months, 4 months in one place and sink in, try to sink into the place, because sometimes it takes time for people to be, to see you around a few times, to socialize with you before you talk to them. That's the luxury I sort of have because I'm not affiliated with any wire service or news organization that needs me to file a story in 45 minutes. And I met a lot of good journalists in Bosnia, for example, and they could only stay 3 or 4 hours in a place like Gorazde because they had to be back in Sarajevo later to file a story. So I never had to worry about that. So yeah, I call it sort of slow journalism. It's just sort of trying to find out about the people, trying to get to know them, let them get to know you a bit, and then try to do your work. Also, you know, I don't have a lot of equipment. TV crews will come, and sometimes a TV can, a lot of cameras can change a situation. People play with the cameras. If they see me enough in the street and I'm talking to them, they sort of, in a way, I blend in just a little more. Like I said, I don't think you have to be a cartoonist for that to happen, but it's one of the advantages of being a cartoonist.
What is the function of the journalist nowadays? Because the facts are all around. Everybody can get the facts, get the images, get the pictures. Do you think the profession of the journalist is kind of changing?
Well, I mean, it's getting, on some level, it's getting weaker because the institutional journalists, and there's some really good ones, don't have the sort of money. The institutions don't have the sort of money that they used to have. I mean, I think the function of journalism is basically to question the narrative and to question the authorities. And if you quote someone from the authorities, you only quote it to measure it against what actually is happening. You put it into relief against what is actually going on the ground. So I see journalism as somehow an adversarial profession, trying to find out, well, is this really true what they're telling us? And that's basically it.
So it's more, I mean, before kind of internet times, a journalist was having the facts no one else had, or the foreign correspondent did have the facts that no one else has. Now everybody has access to the facts. So his function would be like to make this interpretation or to sort out the relevant from the irrelevant.
A journalist should be doing this. I think a lot of journalists get used to sort of being in that circle of power. I mean, the closer you get to power, the more appealing it is. You're around these powerful people, they're kind of like celebrities in a way, and you kind of want to be around it. I think that happens to a lot of journalists, and then they get too close. They think they have a distance, but if you're going to the same cocktail parties, you know, you're not really going to report well on those people.
Do you think there's a need from part of the audience to have this kind of slow journalism more and more? I mean, one can notice, like in a country like France, there's all these magazines now devoted only to journalism. In Switzerland, there's a magazine called Reportage, which is only long reportage.
I think there's a thirst for it. I mean, I spoke to the editor of 21 magazine in France, and it's all long-form narrative journalism, some prose, some photographs, and always a cartoonist that they send somewhere. And he told me that everyone told him he was making a big mistake by trying to start a magazine that had long-form journalism and no advertising. Because basically the model that you keep hearing is, oh, it has to be read very quickly, you know, from one subway stop to another. That's what people want. And maybe that's fine for the subway, but I think an intelligent audience wants to be treated intelligently. And that's one way to treat them intelligently, is to actually give them the whole story. And then it allows you to approach journalism in sort of a literary way. You can give them more than just facts. You can tell the story in a good and interesting way.
And do you think it's important that there's also more and more drawn pictures, not necessarily in comic form, but also kind of as illustrations, or to replace photography by the drawing?
I would never want to replace photography, because I think photography has its own real great power. But you know, each form has its power, I think. So I would never want to actually replace photography. But I think it's great that they're sending artists, cartoonists out, because they'll see the world in a different way too. They can take the reader back into the past. And photography, I mean, a photojournalist can't actually take you back into the past. They're very much about the present, what's happening in front of them.
What else are the differences you would see between photography and the drawing?
Well, if we're talking about comics, I mean, the whole point of a good photojournalist is to have one picture that sums up a whole situation. So you look at a picture of a child in, you know, a country, and the child is emaciated, and you know, there's the vulture right next to it, and you understand exactly what's happening. That's the power of that sort of thing. With a cartoonist, because of multiple images, might show you a lot more than that. It might show you the village that the child is from, and show you a lot of information. More like it's creating, a cartoonist or someone who's drawing can create an atmosphere. I remember when I was in Gaza, I would write down things, images that I saw that I couldn't take a photograph of, like the way the dust was swirling. Now maybe a good photographer can get that sort of thing, but I would remind myself of things like that. The dust was swirling everywhere. I would remind myself that, you know, don't forget to draw children everywhere, because there are a lot of children that are always following you around, so don't forget to draw something like that. So I think an artist has a chance to sort of create that sort of atmosphere.
But do you think the photography has lost something in the last years, because there's so many billions of photographies being made every day now from every event? Do you think that maybe also in the news context there's a certain banalization of the photo? People are tired of photos because they get so much of it, and well, the appeal of drawings at the moment is because it seems fresher, also it's old hand photography.
I'm not sure if I can speak to that. I mean, again, I'm not going to sort of knock photography because I think it's really a very powerful medium. The thing is, sometimes what drawing does, it helps you to see certain things. There are certain photographs or certain documentary films I see of certain situations that make it really hard to look at them because they show humans suffering, humans in pain. It's hard to look at a real image of a human in pain. I mean, those images you saw from South Africa with people getting necklaced where they put the tire around their neck and they light it on fire. Seeing film of that or photographs of that, I mean, to me it's sort of repulsive. Okay, there's a record of it, but I can't really look at it. If you drew something like that, it allows you to look because it's just one step removed from reality. So it allows you to look at those sorts of moments that otherwise would be almost too much to bear.
Also, when doing a drawing, and I think your detailed drawing, making kind of visible that you spend quite some time on a drawing, on a panel. While taking this time, is it also for you a moment of, is it just work, handcraft, or is it also kind of reflections, a reflection of what you're drawing going into the drawing?
You go in and out of it. I mean, the truth is, if you had to reflect the whole time, it would be crushing. Because it's actually hard to draw some situations than it is to see them or to talk to people about them. Because when you're talking to people, you're sort of, you know, you're controlling a situation. Often you're speaking to people and they're jumping from one story to another, and you're trying to keep them on topic. So just the energy that it takes to try to keep them on topic removes you from the emotion of what they're telling you. And that's very useful if you're a journalist, because you need to be somehow, you listen to these awful stories, and you need to sort of coldly try to get that story. So you're like a surgeon, and you just try to get out the story. When you're drawing those stories, it's harder because you actually have to inhabit the story. You have to feel the emotion of the person. You're drawing that person, you have to think about what they went through. So it's a bit more involved emotionally. Yeah, so
you end up not drawing the faces of...
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, I mean, there are times when it's really difficult to draw things, and then I'm working on a street scene or a car that I've drawn a million times before, and then, you know, it's turn up the Rolling Stones and just draw the car. And you can't be intense the whole time, because I think it would be too much. So you go out, sometimes it's meditative. You know, I draw these lines over and over. That's very meditative for me. People say, why do you do that? And I realize half the reason I do it is I would miss not doing it. It might not add anything to the drawing, but I need it when I'm doing it.
You mentioned Iraq as a possible new destination. Is that...
No, I went to Iraq.
You went to Iraq?
Yeah, a few years ago.
But what is your next project then? Do you have something bigger in mind, or?
Well, I want to do a book about ancient Mesopotamia, so I'd like to go back to Iraq.
And in time.
Back in time. Back in time. See, well, I mean, if you can draw, you have the time machine as your hand. So.
Ancient Mesopotamia. Why?
Again, I began thinking of human nature, and I wanted to get away from conflict, and I was approached by the Louvre. And they've approached other artists, cartoonists, to go there and look at anything in their collection, and they will help you out, blah, blah, blah. So I thought, well, what should I look at? And I thought, maybe I'm so bored by these, you know, clay pots. And I always associate archaeology with clay pots. So I thought, I'll do a book about that, because it just sounded so strange. But then when I went into this room in the Louvre, their Near Eastern room, the first thing you see is a big monument in pieces, in fragments. It's from about 2450 BC. It's called the Stele of the Vultures. and it depicts a battle in panels, basically 4 panels with words. It's almost like a comic. And there's a big mound of bodies. And people are climbing the mound to throw earth on the bodies. And I thought, I can never get away from it. So I felt like, okay, I'd like to write about how we set up our structures. And I realized as soon as I began reading about Mesopotamia in depth, and I've been interviewing archaeologists and Assyriologists, it's clear that many structures we know and love today were there, formed almost right at the beginning. Things like conscription, taxation, credit, debt. Human structures are there, and I'm very interested in hierarchy. How did hierarchy develop? Because I'm thinking, why do men go to war? Why does this general tell them to do this, and why do they do it? I mean, those are very basic, simple questions, but those are the ones I have now.
And you think you'll find the answers?
I don't know if I'll find the answers, but it's something you mentioned earlier. It gives you time to reflect, and it gives me a chance to think about. Maybe get a bit closer to the answers. I'm not sure if I'll ever have the answers.
Did you do the Leporello at the Battle of the Somme before seeing this Mesopotamian picture in the Louvre, or after?
Probably after, yeah, after. But it all sort of, in some ways, subconsciously, it all sort of goes together in a way. You begin to think, wow, we were behaving like this back when we were just city-states.
Thank you very much. Now we have still some time for the audience to ask questions. Also Sie können die Fragen auch sehr gerne auf Deutsch stellen und ich übersetze sie für Joe Sacco. Das ist alles kein Problem. Es sind so viele Leute da. Ich denke, es gibt auch sehr viele Fragen, die ich nicht angesprochen habe, die gestellt werden könnten. Da ist ja schon gleich die erste Frage. Es geht ja rasch.
Hi, I'd like to ask in English. And I don't know how interesting this question might be for everybody else, but for me, I'm also trying to do comics in a way like you do documentary and stuff. But I'm more interested in the technical. I mean, I have a technical question that how do you plan out your comics in terms of amount of time and space? Do you script them from the beginning till the end, and then you start drawing? How's the working process go?
Okay, when I come back from a place, I get all my notes together. I index them. It takes me weeks actually to do that. So I can have a topic or a person and I know exactly where that person appears in my journals or in my interviews. So then I write a script from start to finish. With the script, I never know how long it's going to take. It could take 6 weeks, it could take 6 months. After the script is done, I start drawing. I don't storyboard. I mean, my bad advice to you is not to storyboard, because it's not good advice, necessarily. But if I storyboarded beforehand, I would feel that, oh, here's a storyboard I did 6 years ago, and I'm still drawing from that storyboard. It would feel like everything was set in stone. I need something spontaneous to happen the day I'm drawing. So the script is pretty much set. Obviously, you're taking things out of the script when you realize you can draw them. And then it's just the process of drawing until I'm finished. And normally, because I'm working in long form, I don't care how long it goes. If it goes on for another 100 pages, okay, that's just time, but I'll let it go as long as it goes. I have worked where they told me, we need 30 pages, this magazine wants 30 pages, and then you have to be a little more careful, but I sort of know that basically 1 page of script is about 3 pages of drawing. I mean, you get a basic formula from your own. That's my formula. Yours might be different.
I'm just curious.
Yeah. So you come up with those formulas just with experience. Sure.
Also a question about how long does it take you to make 1 page?
A page of my journalism stuff, I can generally say, I mean, drawing is like digging a ditch. You sort of know how much you can do every day. And basically, a page is about 2.5 days, each page.
Yeah. How do you manage to detach yourself from the material that you are writing about drawing? I mean, you said drawing is a level of detachment, but still you're confronted with human misery. You've been to Palestine, you've had Garage Day, and if you talk, or if you listen to other journalists, they often say you can't leave this behind you, and it sticks with you. So how do you handle this?
Well, I mean, that's one of the reasons I wanted to get away from conflict reporting. Because at some point, you begin to worry more about yourself than you do about the people you're talking to. So when you reach that point, perhaps you're not effective. And so I needed to take a break. Maybe I'll go back to it. I will go back to journalism, but I don't think I want to do conflict journalism. I mean, everything is conflict. Poverty is about conflict. Human migration is about conflict. But that sort of violent conflict, I don't think I'd ever like to do something like that again.
Yeah, that's it.
I'm wondering, when you're doing a historical piece, you depend completely on subjective journalism, so everything you read is written by certain people, you know, is that something you might want to correct in your version of history?
Are you talking about like the First World War?
Yeah, and also in Mesopotamia.
Well, what I'm doing there is, I know I can't write a definitive account of what happened in Mesopotamia. And if you talk to archaeologists or Assyriologists, they also will say the same thing. There's a lot of arguments between them about what happened. But I'm just interested in learning enough that I can ask them intelligent questions. So I'll probably just, as much as possible, it'll be based on what they have to tell me. It's going to be difficult to do because getting images, the right images, might be difficult. Understanding what things look like might be difficult. You have to rely on very small things like cylinder seals, little images on cylinder seals, and things like that. And you have to realize too that most of the documentary evidence or texts from that time were used as propaganda. I mean, yeah, except for the economic stuff, all the lists of how many sheep and how many goats, most writing was about glorifying a ruler, or about justifying what they did. So I'm talking to archaeologists also who really question this and try to approach things from a human level, from the people up. So I think about those things all the time, yeah.
What was your intention with the Great War around?
What was my intention? Again, I wanted to think, because part of the luxury of drawing, one of the things it is just to draw, is it gives you time to think. So for me, what I wanted to do was basically, I had two things in mind, the general and the graves. And so to me, there's an organic connection between the general and the graves, and I wanted to sort of show everything that happens in between the two. That was what was in my mind. And then again, I wanted to think of drawing people as a mass, because on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, most of the soldiers going over the top, the British Army, were volunteers. The first soldiers who were drafted, conscripted to go, didn't fight until later in 1916. So these people were relatively enthusiastic. They wanted to get into the war. So when you're drawing all the soldiers sort of cheerily going off to war, that's accurate. That's the attitude they had. They were told, most of them were told, that no German would survive the heavy 7-day bombardment on their trenches. So they thought they were going. Some of them were told that you will find no one alive in the enemy trenches. So I wanted to think about that and reflect on that enthusiasm that young men often have about going off to war. It's not just a matter of ideology. I think somehow young men are drawn to this sort of thing.
Yeah?
Yeah, hi. I was really struck by what you had to say about photographs of atrocity and how those can be too hard to look at, and how drawings are ones that removed and you can bear to look at them just. My question would be, why would that be necessary then, to include those particular gruesome details? Do you feel that you need them as a part of your story, or don't they achieve the same thing with all the other detail you have in there without showing the actual specificity of someone being shot and bleeding to death?
Okay, so the question's about the gruesome nature of some of the drawings, and are those necessary? I mean, violence is ugly, and I do believe that you should depict violence, but what I try to do is not glory in it. When you're talking about a massacre of hundreds of people, that's particularly bloody. You have to give the reader a sense of that without like you say, making it so gruesome you can't look at it. A lot of readers have told me that they sometimes have to put down the book and walk away for a while and start to read again, and I understand that. But it might be, I think it would be a lot harder to see film footage that was continuous like this. And do I strike the right balance? It might be different for each reader. I try to strike the right balance for myself. I can only use myself as sort of a barometer. And hopefully it works for the reader. There might be some readers who find it objectionable.
I didn't mean I kind of...
No. There might be some who would have a hard time reading it. I mean, quite honestly, do I want to read a book about a massacre? You know, I have to ask myself that question sometimes. And I have a lot of books piled up. People send me their books about massacres, and I often don't read them.
Vielleicht noch zwei Fragen und dann, ja.
I just want to come back to what you said about the power of images and that you're not really good at telling stories, but that you prefer to draw them because that makes it interesting. So I was wondering if you could reflect on, let's say, the disadvantages of the comics medium. I mean, you talk about the luxury of thinking and drawing and gives you time to reflect. But where would you say are the disadvantages, maybe, of
the disadvantages are somehow related to the advantages, because drawing gives you time to reflect, but it takes years to do some of these drawings and some of these books. And you know, after 2 years, when you're away from a particular subject, let's say I return from Gaza, for 2 years I can sort of taste it in my mouth, and then it begins to fade. And then I really have to rely on visual descriptions that I made for myself in my journals. But I've done this work enough to know that that's going to happen, so I'm constantly describing things visually in my journals. And I'm constantly trying to, like I said, I leave little notes to myself, don't forget to draw children. Because 3 years later you forget to draw children, and then you go, oh yeah, that's right, I have to draw this, that's what it was like.
Eine letzte Frage.
I was wondering, today there's more and more comics that become movies, and I was wondering if you ever considered making one of your books like Ari Folman did Waltz and Bashir, reading your books, it makes them seem very lively, and move very quickly reading them. So were you ever considering this genre, or do you have, what do you think about it?
I've been asked that a number of times, and Book Footnotes in Gaza is a French production company that's working on a version of that. So I've resisted doing films, and what I'm resisting is getting involved in it. I trust the writer. The director changed now, so I don't know who the new director is going to be, but I sort of don't want to get involved because I know that if I do, all the problems with film will then be my problems too. And I've told them, I'd like this to be your impression of my work, not my impression of what you should be doing, because then I'll start to micromanage. And the writer already told me how he's going to use my character, and it's not the way I would do it, but I think, okay, that's your vision of who I am, so that's fine. That's just another approach. So I have a very hands-off relationship with this project.
Is it an animation?
It's going to be animated, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for coming here.